the unstoppable titan of action film, Steven Seagal, whose mere appearance on screen was enough to move millions of people, rose like a raging storm in the late 1980s and early 1990s, defeating rivals and controlling the box office with Under Siege, the masterpiece that made him an indelible Hollywood legend. He was more than just a performer. He was the very definition of strength. He was a steel-forged warrior, a monument whose silence bore the solemn weight of justice and whose every blow reverberated like thunder. Behind that glittering splendor, however, were scars that time would never be able to heal. 3 marriages turned to ashes, a successful career gradually shattered, and the quiet anguish of witnessing the empire he had created with his own hands crumble. And now, at 71, the storms that encircle him are more intense, isolated, and unrelenting than ever before, a final trial more severe than any part he has ever played, a twilight conflict where shadows continue to cling to the once unbreakable legend. What secrets are concealed in his stronghold? What unsaid suffering remains in this warrior's heart? Together, let's discover the journey. Before we start, please remember to press like as a sincere homage to this timeless legend. If Steven Seagal was ever a part of your childhood, it is devastating to learn that the man who was once praised as Hollywood's unbeatable warrior once had trouble breathing. His very existence was a precarious struggle against the weight of his own body before the lights and the applause. On April 10, 1952, Stephen Frederick Seagal was born in Lansing, Michigan, into a working-class family that had no idea what kind of movie stardom their son would become. His mother, Patricia, worked long hours as a medical technician, her hands frequently tired, but her resolve unwavering. His father, Samuel, taught mathematics with quiet dignity. Their home was a place of sacrifice, where every comfort was earned and every dollar was stretched. Even though they were not wealthy, there were rumors that Stephen would never lead a normal life because he was such a weak child. To his family, he was the delicate center of their entire universe, but to the outside world, he was just weak. His childhood was encircled by asthma like an unseen chain, depriving him of the pleasures that other kids took for granted. The sound of shallow, irregular breathing and the soft footsteps of a mother pacing the floor, terrified by every wheeze, fearing it was his last, filled the nights. Through a window pane, Stephen watched the neighborhood boys race under the open sky, his small frame pressed against the glass, wishing for the freedom his body denied him. Seldom did schoolchildren comprehend. Their taunting remarks pierced as deeply as his aching lungs, leaving invisible wounds, knowing that every doctor's appointment, every restless night, and every sacrifice made by his parents was for him. Stephen carried the burden of guilt even at such a young age. The harshness of fate was that his greatest struggle originated inside his own chest, rather than from any villain. When Stephen was just 5 years old in 1957, his parents took a drastic measure. Their boy was gradually being suffocated by Michigan's harsh and cruel winters, clinging to the hope that warmth and sunshine might save him. They left everything they had built behind and moved west to Fullerton, California. It was a difficult move. Patricia bore the silent pain of beginning anew, and Samuel took on greater responsibilities to support them. However, their loyalty remained unwavering. Although the son of California gave Stephen fresh life, the shadow of his weakness never completely disappeared. He was still thin, fidgety, and plagued by the fear of being weak. However, a seed of defiance sprouted inside that fear. He started to listen, watch, and dream of strength. He would later recall this as his rebirth. I was saved by the warm air. I was able to move and breathe for the first time. It was already a greater victory than any future box office success for a child who had only known weakness to stand tall and breathe fearlessly. The foundation of the warrior, fragile in body, but unbreakable in spirit, was established in this furnace of weakness and despair. Strength was destiny for a boy who had once struggled to breathe. And in 1974, that fate brought 22-year-old Steven Seagal to Japan, a country that few Westerners were ever permitted to visit. The actual trip was unlikely, practically unimaginable. Outsiders were rarely allowed in the traditional Aikido dojos, which were defended strongholds of discipline and secrecy in the middle of the 1970s. Nevertheless, Seagal entered this world with nothing more than his will and an unyielding heart. Still thin and scarred from years of weakness, but blazing with resolve, Fujitani, the daughter of a renowned Aikido master in Osaka, was brought to him by fate. She was already a black belt, disciplined, strong, and a teacher. Their encounter was more than just a romantic one. It was fate disguised as a person. In addition to love, Miyako gave Seagal access to a custom that most outsiders could only observe. But the road was ruthless. His body could not be protected by love, but it could warm his heart. Respect had to be gained through suffering on the mats. Students gave him suspicious looks. Masters put him to the test mercilessly. He sensed the disdain in their looks more than once. What would make an American brave enough to enter the hallowed halls of Japanese martial arts? Day after day, the training broke him down. Every muscle screamed as he was forced to rise again after being slammed to the tatami, until his bones hurt. Even more lonely were the evenings, when the unfamiliar streets of Osaka seemed colder than Michigan winters and uncertainty murmured that he would never fit in. He had wounds beneath the white gi, bruises no one could see. He was determined to outlive their skepticism, so he returned every morning, bowing low before the same teachers who had doubted him. He remained upright thanks to Miyako's quiet encouragement, which reminded him that the true meaning of Aikido was endurance. Something extraordinary had started to change by the late 1970s. Once a source of skepticism, the outsider was now respected. His throws were more accurate, and he moved with the weight of stone and the flow of water. He embodied Aikido instead of just imitating it. He was gradually given responsibility for what had previously seemed impossible, helping with instruction and eventually running a dojo himself. Even those who had previously written Seagal off as an intruder were taken aback by his achievement, which made him one of the first Americans to operate an Aikido dojo in Japan. It took a lot of blood, sweat, and unwavering determination for a boy who had once struggled to breathe as a child to become a teacher among masters. However, victory in Japan wasn't the end. It was just a chapter. In martial arts circles, his name continued to spread, but a restless fire would not go out. Despite being sacred, the dojo walls were insufficient to match the scope of his ambition. Seagal started to envision something bigger, something that would take his story into the minds of millions of people and transcend mats and rituals. The young man who had once engaged in invisible lung combat was now ready to compete for a spot on the biggest stage in the world. Steven Seagal was not the victorious figure he would eventually become when he returned to the United States in the early 1980s. He came back as a man torn between the restless energy of America and the revered discipline of Japan. He and his reliable partner Haruo Masaoka opened an Aikido dojo in West Hollywood in 1983 when he was 31 years old. Despite its modest size and location in the center of Los Angeles, the dojo held the discipline of a foreign land, the echoes of Osaka, and the scars from innumerable falls. Initially, it was survival rather than glory. The mats were frequently empty even after the dojo demanded endless hours of teaching. It swallowed every dollar he had. Bills were like silent predators, haunting him, and rent notices were piling up. And on some evenings, he stood by himself in the dojo's dim light, holding a broom, and gazing at the unpaid bills strewn across the desk. At night, his loneliness reverberated through the same walls that during the day echoed with the throes of his students. Pupils arrived with both doubt and curiosity. What was this art that absorbed and redirected instead of striking or kicking? After just one lesson, some people departed, mocking Aikido as merely dance. Seagal battled for the roof over his head as well as for respect. He would later remember, "I wasn't trying to show off. I was attempting to demonstrate to them how to live." In actuality, though, he was the one struggling to live financially, physically, and spiritually. Osaka was not Los Angeles. He had carried the burden of expectation in Japan. He bore the burden of debt in California. Slowly, respect emerged. The money came more slowly. Additionally, the dojo's future was repeatedly on the verge of disintegrating. Seagal, however, declined to bow, working as a martial arts coordinator on the side. He contributed his talents to movies like The Challenge 1982 and even James Bond's Never Say Never Again 1983. These were minor triumphs, fleeting escapes from the specter of failure, but they preserved hope and the lights. But it was never enough to stand behind the camera. The fire inside him grew hotter each time he watched stuntmen act out what he had bled to master. He yearned to be in front of the camera to prove to the world that the boy who briefly gasped for air, the foreigner who was once questioned in Japan, could stand tall in Hollywood. However, ambition was insufficient on its own. Agents threw him out. Every door seemed to slam before it opened, and executives shook their heads. He was merely an outsider to most, a broke martial artist holding onto a dying dream. However, the weak child had been Steven Seagal. On Japanese mats, he was the foreigner who was made fun of. At midnight, he had been the teacher sweeping empty floors with no assurance that students would arrive the following day. Every time he had persevered, every time doubt had stalked him. And now in Los Angeles, he was ready to get back up again, despite the fact that the weight of unpaid bills was pressing down on him like chains. He taught nonstop, sharpened his craft with ruthless discipline, and bided his time until fate would finally recognize him. That time had not yet arrived. He continued to be the dreamer in West Hollywood for the time being, the man who, with rough hands and almost empty pockets, locked the dojo doors at night, his spirit burning like a blade drawn in the dark. He had not yet become the Hollywood icon or the star of Above the Law, however. He carried an unwavering truth with him every night. When he ventured out into the merciless streets of Los Angeles, every bruise, every bill, and every empty classroom was homing him. The battle was far from over. Steven Seagal was determined to carve his name into the light of the world's greatest stage, which was waiting for him. When fate finally let Steven Seagal in, it did so with a thunderclap that rocked Hollywood to its foundations rather than a whisper. He had been the man in the background for years, instructing in silent dojos and directing fight scenes behind the camera, while he waited for a moment no one believed would ever arrive. That opportunity came in 1988 when Seagal entered the public eye with Above the Law at the age of 36. When most actors were already well into their careers, it was the most unlikely of breakthroughs, a movie written in part by a man who had never been the star, starring an unidentified face with a composed voice, a ponytail, and eyes that demanded attention rather than begging for it. The risk paid off in unexpected ways. In addition to being the star of Above the Law, Seagal changed the definition of an action hero. His battles were vicious, effective displays of skill rather than staged displays of glitz and glamour. The authenticity of a man who had lived the art, not just studied it for the screen, was evident in every bone-shattering move, throw, and wrist lock. The audiences were in a state of shock. Despite their disagreements, critics acknowledged that he had an unmistakable presence that was icy, in control, and terrifyingly real. The quiet outsider became the newest and most unlikely star in Hollywood overnight. There was no stopping the momentum. His legend was further carved by the arrival of Hard to Kill 1990, Marked for Death 1990, and Out for Justice 1991, which came like hammer blows. He was the unexpected avenger on screen, the unyielding force of nature that put an end to fights before they started. His stillness was more menacing than 1,000 threats, and his silence was more powerful than words. By 1992, Seagal had become a phenomenon rather than merely an action star. Under Siege, the pinnacle of his career, was released that year. Seagal's portrayal of Casey Ryback, the former Navy SEAL turned cook who killed terrorists on board the USS Missouri, was the ideal balance of tenseness, charm, and intensity. The movie, which made over $150 million worldwide, was praised as one of the best action thrillers of its time. The boy who used to wake up in the middle of the night gasping for air was now undisputed as Hollywood's unstoppable hero. Not only was Steven Seagal standing shoulder to shoulder with Stallone, Schwarzenegger, and Van Damme for a fleeting, fiery moment, but he was also redefining the language of action film itself. The cruelest irony, however, is that glory can occasionally harbor the seed of its own demise. The very basis of Steven Seagal's success was starting to crumble at the time of his quick ascent. The heyday of muscle-driven action movies was coming to an end by the middle of the 1990s. The types of heroes and storytelling techniques that audiences were drawn to were changing. Therefore, the storm clouds of decline were already building on the horizon during the height of his fame, when his name still brought millions of people to theaters. Devastating was the first crack. Seagal directed On Deadly Ground in 1994, which he described as his most intimate project. He infused it with not only battle scenes, but also his love for preserving the environment, interlacing environmental messages with gunshots and explosions. It was supposed to be his declaration evidence that he was capable of more than a silent vengeance. Hollywood, however, was unforgiving. The box office collapsed beneath him, audiences turned away, and critics ripped it apart. That film was from my heart, Seagal acknowledged years later. Perhaps I said too much. Perhaps the world wasn't prepared to hear it. Instead of uplifting him, it left him hurt, vulnerable, and questioning whether his voice belonged in the field he had previously dominated. He continued to fight, holding on to what momentum he had left. His reputation was maintained by Executive Decision 1996 and Under Siege 2, Dark Territory 1995. But the magic was evaporating. Thunderous success was no longer assured by the box office. The crowds that used to gasp at everything he did now turned their attention elsewhere. One day you walk into the theater and see your face 10 feet tall on the screen. Seagal said after reflecting on this agonizing change. Then you notice that people are passing your movie without even pausing. You never forget that pain. The fall was irrefutable by the late 1990s. The man who had controlled theaters all over the world was being marginalized. His films were quietly released on DVD without any fanfare or acclaim, and they no longer even made it to theaters. It was humiliation for an actor who had once earned hundreds of millions at the box office. Not just a setback in his career. He went from being a worldwide celebrity to having his name emblazoned on plastic cases that were piled high in bargain stores. The agony was cruel, unrelenting, and oppressive. For Seagal, it was like watching a slow-motion empire fall apart. Another aspect of his identity was taken away with each billboard poster that faded, and each unfulfilled premiere. I've known pain since I was a boy, but nothing hurt like watching everything I built slip away. He admitted in one interview, "The world simply goes on without you, and it's like drowning." The feeling was eerily familiar to the thin child who had once struggled to breathe. He had fought his way up from weakness to the highest echelons of Hollywood, only to find himself gasping once more, this time from the crushing weight of loss rather than illness. Seagal, however, looked for a voice even in the ashes. He reached for the guitar, the one friend who had never left him. As the dazzling lights of Hollywood faded, since he was a frail boy and strumming strings was more difficult than breathing, it had been there. Thus, songs from the Crystal Cave and Mojo Priest were released in 2005 and 2005, respectively. The yearning of a man deprived of his glory. These albums attempted to remind the world that his heart still beat in rhythm and song, rather than the swagger of an action hero. He wasn't Casey Ryback, the silent big screen avenger, when he was on stage with the guitar across his shoulder. Instead, he was Steven, the dreamer, the broken soul seeking atonement in raw lyrics and blues chords. However, the world was cruel. He was dissected by critics using knives sharper than any he had used on screen. They characterized his performances as self-indulgent, his lyrics awkward, and his voice flat. Late-night hosts scoffed, headlines made fun of him, and what had been intended as his rebirth was turned into yet another humiliation. In front of the public, later, Seagal would think in private agony, "I wasn't trying to be famous again. All I wanted to do was play the music I enjoyed." However, there are instances when their laughter hurts more the more truthful you are. Standing in front of a disinterested audience, occasionally even one that was mocking, was a deeper wound than any stunt could ever cure for a man who had once controlled box office receipts across continents. He continued to play. He performed in tiny venues in distant cities where he was no longer in the spotlight. He performed for crowds that occasionally turned away or gave him courteous applause, but always made him realize how far he had fallen. On some evenings, there was little applause and a stone-heavy silence following a song. However, he kept going back to the stage because, at his heart, Steven Seagal had never been a man who gave into mockery. He had been the outsider who made Hollywood see him, the foreigner who braved the harsh dojos of Japan, and the young man who battled asthma. Every time he had risen, he had been undervalued. "You can take away the lights, the money, the fame," he once remarked in retrospect, "but I'm still here as long as I can play a guitar. I remain myself." The truth of his journey was exposed by those words. His albums were seen by the world as an oddity, a footnote to an action star's decline. However, to him, they were a means of survival, a way of not letting silence write his story's last note. So he continued to move forward, bruised, ridiculed, and beaten, but never broken, through music, through film, through every rejection and remark. Desperate to find another way to sustain his empire, Steven Seagal turned his attention to business when the silver screen no longer promised glory. However, the real world outside of Hollywood turned out to be equally cruel. His business endeavors failed one after another, further shattering a sense of pride already shattered by the loss of fame. With Deadly Honor, a project designed to put fans right in the shoes of their action hero, he gave gaming a try in the late 1990s, It was like a resurrection for a moment. However, like so many of his late career films, the project was canceled before it ever made it to the shelves. I thought it would give me a new way to reach people, he would confess years later. It was as if the rug had been pulled out from under me when it vanished. He pushed on, unfazed. At 53, he made his biggest bet to date, an energy drink bearing his name that promised raw power in each can. It appeared for a moment that he might cross a new frontier. However, the drink disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only forgotten cans that were traded as curiosity's strange remnants of a vanished empire. Like a spark that dies before it burns, he made another attempt fragrances designed to evoke his character on screen. Collectibles related to martial arts that emphasized the warrior persona he had developed over decades. However, every endeavor ended the same way: ridiculed, written off, or lost in silence. They served as eerie reminders of his fall rather than as a means of redemption. The market's apathy was cruel in its own way to a man who was once applauded by millions. The collapse of home, rather than a failed product, dealt the greatest blow. He had invested in a sprawling estate in Tennessee that was once worth $3.9 million. It ought to have been a jewel in the crown, a symbol of achievement. Rather, it turned into a gradual humiliation that remained unsold until it was eventually sold for a meager $500,000. For Seagal, who is now in his early 60s, the loss was more than just a monetary one. It was a psychological injury, evidence that the empire he had toiled to create was evaporating like sand. There were nights when I asked myself if I had anything left to give, he would later recollect, but I continued to move despite the darkness. In a rare moment of openness, he said, "The hardest part is not losing the money." As he reflected on those years, it involves losing both the faith you had in yourself and the faith others had in you. The most profound truth of all is revealed by that silent admission. The gradual deterioration of a legend, piece by piece, was Steven Seagal's biggest suffering, not the failure of companies or the loss of property. Perhaps the most eerie picture of all is the one that was never captured on camera. The former Hollywood titan leaving his Tennessee estate with nothing but silence, and the sobering realization that even the strongest can fail. The fact that the man who was once praised as Hollywood's unbeatable warrior fought his most delicate battle in silence, not on screen, but in love, is heartbreaking. For Steven Seagal, the tale of sacrifice started in the silent temples and dojos of Japan rather than in the flashy lights of Los Angeles. He met Miyako Fujitani, the daughter of a renowned Aikido master in Osaka, in 1974 when he was only 22 years old. She was already a well-respected martial artist with her own black belt, and she was graceful, strong, and disciplined. She was more than just a partner to Steven, who was still a foreigner attempting to establish himself. She was a gateway to a revered custom that few Westerners were ever permitted to partake in. Their union appeared to be fate itself, securing his position in life as well as in Japan. He found stability, acceptance, and the flimsy hope of belonging with Miyako. They created a family together, bringing a son and a daughter into a world that, for a split second, seemed invincible. At night, the peaceful streets of Osaka held a young father who may have thought he had found peace at last, while the walls of the dojo reverberated with the sounds of practice. This was more than love for Steven, who had been a boy growing up weak and struggling to breathe. It served as a home, a means of survival, and motivation to fight on. Ambition, however, is a restless companion. The appeal of America increased along with his reputation in Japan. Hollywood rumors, offers of a stage bigger than any dojo, and assurances of immortality that no martial artist could refuse arrived in the early 1980s. When he was 31, Steven made a choice that would alter his life. He brought the art of Aikido back to the United States, but he left behind a wife and small children, who would learn to appreciate absence over presence. Distance can be a cruel destroyer. Days apart became months, then years. Phone calls and letters were unable to break the increasing silence. As Steven pursued his dreams across the ocean, Miyako was left to raise their kids by herself, bearing the burden of their entire world. It was the gradual demise of friendship for her. It was the hollow echo of a father who was absent from school recitals, birthday celebrations, and the simple warmth of daily life for their son and daughter. For Steven, it was the first significant break in a life that would be characterized by loss despite all of its victories. Years later, Seagal revealed the price of that decision in an unusually vulnerable moment. "I wanted the world," he said quietly, "but in chasing it, I lost the people who mattered most. Although the words are straightforward, they are laden with an intolerable sense of regret that persists even after the applause stops and the screen goes black. The lesson is universal and eerie. No warrior, no matter how strong, can fight on the battlefields at once. Ambition came at the cost of a marriage's silence, a home's disintegration, and the upbringing of two kids molded by the protracted shadow of absence. The truth about Steven Seagal's first marriage shows something much more human to viewers, who once thought he was unbreakable, while his fame may shine brightly around him. Family suffers when the spotlight shines too brightly. After experiencing a significant loss, people frequently look for anything to fill the void. Following the dissolution of his first marriage to Miyako Fujitani in Japan, which had brought him love, children, and a sense of belonging, but ended in a sea of regret and distance, Steven Seagal experienced that silence in the early 1980s. At the age of 31, he came back to America by himself, burdened not only with ambition, but also with the shame of abandoning a family. He met actress Adrienne LaRussa in that void, restless and in need of security. Because of her role on Days of Our Lives, Adrienne was admired for her grace. She might have appeared as an anchor, a hope that he could possibly mend what had been shattered. To a man reeling from broken promises and an ocean of absence, like a spark in the dark, their marriage happened quickly, almost without planning. However, even bright sparks don't always turn into fire. Fragile hope gave way almost as fast as it had started. The union disbanded in a matter of months, leaving behind more questions than answers and more silence than comfort. No shared years of adversity to build resilience, no children to unite them. Rather, there was only the subdued reality that Seagal, who was still in his early 30s, was a man torn between the clamor of ambition and the emptiness of regret. The understanding that love born out of desperation cannot withstand the storms of a wounded soul was a quieter and possibly more devastating mark on the marriage to Adrienne LaRussa than scandal or betrayal. Looking back on those restless days years later, Seagal quietly acknowledged, "I was looking for peace in the wrong places, and when you do that, nothing lasts." The truth of the moment is exposed by that infrequent admission. He wasn't yet the man whose name would blare across marquees or the Hollywood icon. He was still the nomad attempting to construct bridges over shattered terrain, only to discover them crumbling underfoot. The marriage to Adrienne LaRussa was ultimately less of a romantic chapter and more of a brief period of restlessness, a halt on a path filled with both success and heartache. It also leaves a painful lesson: no marriage can last if it is entered with emptiness, rather than peace. For Steven Seagal, it served as a subdued reminder that even fighters are powerless to escape their inner silence. The darkest shadows frequently emerge in the brightest radiance of celebrity. The late 1980s and early 1990s were Steven Seagal's unbeatable years. He had risen from the shadows to become one of Hollywood's unstoppable titans, standing shoulder to shoulder with Stallone, Schwarzenegger, and Van Damme, and as though fate itself wanted to crown his victory, he found himself enticed into a romance that appeared to be written in starlight, rather than on paper. A union with Kelly LeBrock, the radiant model and actress whose image had appeared on magazine covers and movie screens all over the world. A screen siren whose beauty had already become legendary, and an action warrior at the pinnacle of his abilities seemed like the ideal combination. To the outside world, their wedding was a spectacle, with cameras flashing around to record every smile, every look, and every vow of eternal love. They were referred to in Hollywood lore as the golden couple, the epitome of power and glitz. Like the stars whose orbits had miraculously aligned, they attracted attention and admiration wherever they went. The glow appeared even brighter behind the cameras. Early on, there was a lot of laughter in their home, the kind that naturally rises when the people think. They have found both permanence and passion. The picture felt complete with the arrival of their 3 children, tiny hands, and fresh starts grounding their lives in something much bigger than celebrity. Their home seemed impenetrable for a while, filled with shared breakfasts, bedtime stories, and the naive delight of kids who had only ever experienced love. Millions of people, possibly even themselves, were persuaded by this fairy tale that Steven Seagal had not only mastered Hollywood, but also life in general. He wasn't just the unstoppable warrior on screen during those years. He was also a father, a husband, and a man who seemed to have the entire world in his hands. However, even fairy tales have shadows, and initially theirs darken almost imperceptibly. The weight of celebrity slowly poisoned their home behind the red carpet appearances. and polished smiles. While Hollywood's merciless machinery demanded all of Seagal's attention, the unrelenting grind of his film sets kept him away for weeks, sometimes months. Subsequently, there were rumors of his adultery and liaisons on the set or behind closed doors. Some were unfounded, fabricated by scandal-hungry tabloids. Others, more incisive, were too close to ignore. Every party headline and every whispered remark was another rift in Kelly's trust. She made an effort to protect herself and ignore the commotion, but the quiet at their dinner table was more powerful than any gossip. The glow in her eyes faded under the weight of questions that had no answers, and what had once been an embrace full of devotion gave way to long nights of suspicion and exhaustion. The glitzy flashbulbs became blinding to Kelly, as her husband sank deeper into the maelstrom of his career and possibly into the temptations that fame so readily provides. She found herself growing more and more alone, raising 3 children and bearing the weight of motherhood mostly alone. Their childhood laughter grew fragile and echoed in once jolly hallways. She would subsequently confess, with devastating candor, that those were some of the most difficult years she had ever experienced, and that leaving was a matter of survival, not rage, for both her soul and the kids, who required security more than show. By the middle of the 1990s, the fractures had changed from cracks to canyons. Seagal's career took a hit in 1994 when his hard-won film On Deadly Ground failed, and at home, his family's foundation collapsed. The timing was brutal. He was fighting wars on the fronts he couldn't win when his marriage and professional empire fell apart. Their separation was far from peaceful. As custody disputes came to an end, Seagal had to deal with the pain of seeing their 3 children grow up mostly out of his sight, while Kelly assumed full responsibility for them. Years of shared dreams were reduced to chilly negotiations, when financial disputes compelled the division of assets and support payments. Meanwhile, tabloids gorged themselves on every detail, converting private sorrow into public spectacle and heartbreak into headlines. For the kids, it was more than just a marriage falling apart. It was the destruction of the only haven they had ever known. It was Kelly's responsibility as a single mother, continuing to be resilient in the face of loss. Seagal came to the painful conclusion that he could not escape the effects of absence and mistrust despite his fame, wealth, or legend. In retrospect, he would quietly confess, "I lost things I could never get back." The harshest lesson the story imparts is that even love encased in fame, fortune, and beauty can crumble under the crushing weight of silence and suspicion. Instead of heroes or villains, what started out as a fairy tale ended up in courtrooms and custody paperwork, leaving 2 adults and 3 kids scarred by the demise of a once unbreakable dream. However, to only see the end is to miss the reality. There were quiet evenings when husband and wife whispered dreams, mornings full of laughter, and the first steps of children cheered by to proud parents for over 10 years. They were merely a family in those years, frail but complete, not icons or action stars. Their demise was a story of 2 hearts broken by silence, distance, and the cruel weight of celebrity rather than one of villains and victims. Years later, with unusual candor, Seagal acknowledged, "I lost things I can never get back," in addition to the loss of a wife. His words also convey the pain of birthdays lost, the quiet of unheard cries, and the empty seats at family gatherings where he ought to have been. "Fame took me everywhere except where I truly needed to be home," he would later think, instead of being gossip. The story of Steven Seagal and Kelly Lebrick serves as a warning and a window for anyone who thinks that success will protect them from the most personal struggles in life. It demonstrates that the brittle ties of home cannot be replaced by an empire of fame, wealth, or victory. This chapter exposes a devastating and universal truth to viewers who previously believed Seagal was unbeatable. Even the most formidable fighters lose, and the most intense conflicts take place in our own homes rather than on screens. As a result, their union, once the envy of millions, ended in silence and tears rather than with cheers, leaving lessons etched in people's hearts. No matter how brilliant at first, love cannot endure without care, respect, and presence. This was the one battle that Steven Seagal was unable to win, and the wounds it caused were more profound than any fight sequence could ever be. People frequently discover their most peaceful havens following the most intense storms. That refuge for Steven Seagal came later, after the scars of broken marriages and the weight of aging had left him with deep scars, rather than during the flaming years of red carpets and flashing bulbs. He first met Ardenia El-Batsik, a beautiful ballroom dancer from Mongolia. As a translator in the early 2000s, thanks to fate, She saw the man, weary and worn, yet still seeking tranquility, where others had only seen the action star, the fading legend. Away from the craziness of Hollywood, their relationship developed gradually and quietly. This union, in contrast to the glittering romances of his past, was the result of quiet conversations, quiet dinner-time laughter, and small gestures that only asked for presence. Seagal, who was now over 50, frequently remarked that it felt like life had given him another chance after they were married and had their son, Kunzang, born. This was a gift of calm for a man who had lived in a tornado, an opportunity to hold hope in his arms and think that home could endure, even if only briefly. Nevertheless, shadows persisted even within this haven. From his prior marriages, Seagal had already given birth to 6 other children, each of whom carried memories of both love and absence. Over the course of decades and continents, a total of 7 children became both his pride and his wound. The missed birthdays, the unattended school plays, and the silent looks of kids who once waited for a father too preoccupied with fame to be present could never be erased by a fresh start. He loved holding his youngest, but the pain of realizing how much had already passed always overshadowed the happiness. The weight was just as heavy for Elle. She was the partner of someone who carried decades of success and regret, not just the wife of a man nearing the end of his career. She provided stability where Hollywood had previously called for glitz. She became the anchor Seagal had long yearned for, staying where others had fled. Together, they made a house that felt more like a haven and less like a stage for the first time in years. The truth, however, cannot be avoided. The past always casts its shadows, no matter how calm the present is. Seagal once said, "What you lose in the storms you can't always bring back," with a quiet honesty that was unusual for him. However, you come to appreciate what you still have. The man behind the myth was exposed by those tired but tender words. He was a proud but remorseful father, a husband who understood that this late-found love might be his last opportunity to cling to something unbreakable. Though less well-known than the others, Steven Seagal's life with Adenia and their son is arguably the most instructive. Its quiet conveys a truth more potent than any action scene, that despite all the conflict, chaos, and casualties, only the brittle, priceless hope of family endures. Although it is not the utopia the world had previously envisioned for him, it is peace, and the greatest victory of all may be peace forged from survival rather than perfection. The fact that the very thing that once made you unique turns out to be your worst enemy is one of life's cruelest ironies. Time has taken a silent, unrelenting toll on Steven Seagal, the man who once moved like a blade drawn in silence. After a lifetime of collisions, throws, and falls, both on and off camera, the character who once personified indestructibility now bears the pain, the weight, and the shadows. The harm didn't wait for old age. Decades ago, it started on harsh sets and in training halls, hips and knees pounded by repetition, shoulders startled by break falls, and wrists snapping through locks. Members of the crew remember the sprains he taped tightly, the bruises he iced silently, and the unyielding pride that surpassed even his physical strength. A terrifying reminder that even legends bleed and that eventually the ground claims every man was. When he was choked unconscious during a notorious rehearsal, the toll had increased by the time he was in his 50s. A heavier frame had replaced the lean, fluid quickness of the 1980s. Aikido's elegant circles condensed into cautious arcs. His life's language, movement, became measured and rationed like a limited resource. But his ponytail and gaze stayed the same. Camera acuity was acquired by directors. More of the weight was on stunt teams. There was a silent sadness in the realization for viewers who had committed his wrist snap, and the abruptness of his throws to memory. Speed gives way to strength. Strength gives way to craft, and craft, if you're lucky, learns to deal with pain. The price was even higher behind closed doors, pre-dawn heat pads, dark stretches, cautious steps down hallways. The wince he tried to conceal with lowering himself into a chair, the hand that pressed against a stiffened back. Now, his joints spoke in a language that no one could ignore. Muscles recalled each blow. Mornings took longer to put together, and nights were shorter. Even a staircase became an honest battle for a man who once swept across a room like a storm. Then there was the mirror. Loss, not vanity. The absence of assurance that his body would respond when summoned. The sharp curves that characterized him grew stale. The quick bursts of speed had vanished. Another enemy was weight, which was made fun of by tabloids and discussed in private by strangers. However, Seagal's grief, the grief of a warrior witnessing the very armor that had created his legend turn against him, was more important than appearances. In an uncommon moment of openness, he once acknowledged, "Every step I take now, I remember the battles that put me here." The humility of a man who has discovered that the body maintains its own ruthless ledger is evident in those words, in addition to the pain. However, a different kind of courage has emerged in his 60s and 70s, the courage to continue to show up, even when you no longer look like the person that people portray you as. He continued to work and perform, allowing presence and timing to take the place of sheer speed. Bravado for stamina, spectacle for endurance. He found a hard-won grace in simply persevering. He thought, "You learn to be grateful for what you have left, but you can't always bring back what you lose in the storms." The dignity of a man who has sacrificed bone and tendon and yet chooses to rise is evident in that sentence. This is not failure for those who grew old with him. It's a mirror. You are familiar with this tale if your knees predict the weather, if the stairs become more steep, or if mornings require more of you than they used to. The story of Steven Seagal's health is no longer one of an unstoppable hero. It is the more subdued, courageous story of a man who learns to accept the passing of time and to value what is left, such as presence, work, family, breath, and an enduring will. Ultimately, the soul determines how to spend what remains after the body has tallied all expenses. And there, Steven Seagal remains, despite the passing of the years. Yes, slower. Yes, heavier, but persistent. Evidence that the ability to keep going, one purposeful step at a time, can occasionally be the purest form of strength. The loudest truths are frequently revealed during the quietest periods of life. Steven Seagal, who is now in his 70s, no longer walks the red carpets of Hollywood with the same awe that once rocked the globe. Rather, he resides in seclusion within a fortress-like estate in Arizona. It is a vast property that is surrounded by tall statues of samurai, reinforced with bulletproof glass, and has an infinity pool that appears to pour straight into the desert sky. It appears to be a castle to outsiders. For those who are familiar with his story, it seems more like a storm-tormented fortress, a haven for a man who used to rule the screen, but now just wants peace. The rise and fall of his real estate speaks for itself. Years before, he had spent $3.9 million on a magnificent mansion in Tennessee that had acres of land and the opulence of an action star at the height of his fame. However, the property remained on the market for a while, losing value as his career faded. He ultimately sold it for just under $500,000, which is a significant loss compared to any on the battlefield. Seagal saw the house's walls as a reminder that no empire, no matter how strong, is impervious to decay rather than a symbol of achievement. Today, all that is left are shards of the legend and an estimated $14 million in fortune, which is sufficient to guarantee comfort, but a small portion of the enormous wealth accumulated by his contemporaries who experienced the same surge of fame in the 1980s and 1990s. However, his garage still reverberates with the symbols of strength and speed, a sleek Mercedes G that speaks to a more subdued, quieter taste of luxury, a rare Jaguar XJ220 that was once one of the fastest cars on the planet, a vintage 1973 Mustang that roars of rebellion, and a sturdy 1987 Chevrolet Caprice that evokes the highways of old America. They are more than just machines. They are artifacts, a reminder of a man who once lived life to the fullest and now sits and listens to those engines churning away. Family is what matters most. Steven Seagal, who is now in his 70s, has chosen the calmer rhythm of home over the bustle of sets and the din of movie theaters. He is raising their son, Kun Zhang, with his wife, Erdenia El Basuk, a Mongolian dancer who became his anchor. He has had 7 children throughout his life, and he is now a grandfather. Their pride, the tangible evidence of a legacy, is evident in their faces. However, there is also a reflection of years past in their eyes, birthdays lost, unheard laughter, and the places where ambition once triumphed over presence. His family constantly reminds him of the brittle, ephemeral moments that cannot be reclaimed. But fame gave him immortality on screen. His body, which was once his legend's blade, now demands kinder rights. His mornings are stabilized by meditation. The ancient rhythm is maintained through light martial arts practice, and what strength is left is maintained through discipline and eating. However, the mirror is not deceiving. Gone is the warrior of the 1980s and 1990s. The frame is heavier, the face is lined, and the lightning speed has given way to the slow deterioration of time. These days, he rarely goes on movie sets, opting instead for smaller projects and the unseen pleasures of family dinners, easy training, and nights spent in the comfort of belonging rather than the cacophony of applause. Even so, there is a quiet pain, the pain of knowing that the thunder has subsided, that the world will never again roar his name, and that the empire that was once erected with fists, silence, and presence has vanished into the past. This sorrow has nothing to do with wealth or notoriety. It is about identity, the man who became unbreakable on screen, the boy who once gasped for air, and the elderly man who now bears equal parts pride and regret. However, to focus solely on what was lost is to overlook the more profound reality. One of the few action stars who has left their mark on the industry is Steven Seagal. Long after the spotlight faded, his stillness, his sudden ferocity, and his unique style left their mark on film. His story, interwoven with triumph and collapse, serves as a reminder to all of us that while glory fades, the will to persevere endures. That family and health are priceless possessions that money cannot buy, and that every victory has a price, and that every price leaves a scar that defines who we are. From the frail boy struggling to breathe in Lansing to the warrior who stood among Hollywood's titans to the elderly man who now finds serenity in the desert, Seagal's life is more than just a movie star's story. It is a reflection of the human condition, a reminder that love endures, time humbles, and that the most intense conflicts are never fought on screens or in arenas, but rather in our hearts and homes. Even though you are aware of his flaws, what memories do you have of Steven Seagal if he was ever a part of your childhood? Which of his movies made you want to stay up late? After all these years, which moments remain memorable? Leave a comment with your thoughts. To preserve the tales of the stars who influenced our lives, please subscribe to our channel and leave a like in honor of a warrior who was both memorable and flawed. Because when we think of them, we also think of our best qualities.